I spent years hating him, ignoring his calls, deleting messages. Then he died, and I realized I never told him I forgave him. This is how I live with the silence, and how I try to make peace with the ghost of the man I couldn't face. I never imagined I'd speak these words aloud, even in the privacy of my own empty kitchen, but here they are. My name is David, I live in suburban Ohio, and I carried the weight of my father's anger and my own stubborn pride for most of my life. He died last spring, and I never found the courage to forgive him or to ask for forgiveness before he slipped away. I owe you this confession not because I want sympathy, but because somehow, saying it helps me breathe. My childhood memories are a patchwork of heat, both the scorching afternoons when he'd order me to finish chores under the relentless sun, and the way his temper flared like a midsummer storm. Dad didn't raise his hand often, his wrath was quieter, colder. He'd cut me off mid-sentence with a look so sharp it felt like glass in my throat. His disapproval was never voiced directly, it was a silent current that ran under every conversation, every expectation I failed to meet. I learned early to swallow my questions, my disappointments, my bruised little heart. My mother left when I was 10, and Dad never spoke of her absence. He just kept working, drinking, and giving me that same unreadable stare. By the time I left for college, I'm sure he thought I'd run away from him forever. And maybe I did run, or maybe I walked away, step by deliberate step, refusing to look back. I stopped calling. I missed birthdays, holidays, graduating from college, the day I moved into my own apartment. Every time my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize, I hoped someone had called about something else. When I learned he'd had a mild heart attack, I thought, good. Maybe now he'll soften. But the heart heals when you let it. He never did. He never called me back. Years passed. I built a life that looked respectable on the outside, complete with a steady job and a relationship that might have been lasting if I hadn't carried so much baggage. I moved to a different state, far enough that his calls, if they came, would show up as unknown numbers, discouraging enough that I could ignore them and say I was busy. I told myself that distance was necessary, that I was protecting myself from his judgment. I pretended I was too occupied to care, that he hardly mattered anymore. But every time someone asked me about family, my throat tightened, my chest burned with a shame that had no outlet. Then one evening, almost by accident, I glanced at his last voicemail. His voice trembled. I know I haven't been a good father. I miss hearing your voice. I didn't answer. I let that message sit, replaying in a loop until I deleted it. The guilt was a dull ache I tried to ignore. When his condition worsened, my phone rang again and again. My sister, whom I barely knew, left frantic messages. I hesitated. I told myself I needed time to think. Time to pull myself together. Time to decide exactly what I would say when I finally spoke to him. But time, as I would learn, is not a commodity you can postpone on demand. He died before I called. It was a sudden complication after what should have been routine. My sister called me at dawn. I stared at the ceiling, breathing shallowly, trying to will myself to move. When I finally stood up, it felt as though my legs had no idea what to do. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tears I did not allow myself to shed, of broken sentences I couldn't form, of faces I couldn't look at. And then came the funeral where I spoke nothing at all. I shook hands mechanically, smiled through the tears of other mourners, while inside I was quiet, empty. I watched the distance between his coffin and me and realized I'd always kept that same distance in life too. In the days after the burial, I found myself sitting by the old oak tree in the backyard where he taught me to skip stones. I remembered how he laughed when I finally got the rhythm right, how he ruffled my hair in approval. I remembered how I hated him for it later, seeing that laugh as weakness, that affection as pity. I'd convinced myself love meant proving myself, proving him wrong. But that afternoon, I saw a different memory, my father's face soft in the golden light, hopeful when he asked about my dreams. I'd never told him I wanted to write, that I imagined pages filled with my words. I kept it inside because I feared disappointment, afraid he'd laugh or roll his eyes or tell me to get a real job. I realized, too late, that he loved me in the only way he knew how. That his anger was messy love, shaped by his own fears and failures. It didn't excuse the pain, but understanding it softened my heart into something like regret. I hadn't just refused to forgive him, I had refused to let him see me as a man, with doubts and dreams and a need for his acceptance. I refused to be vulnerable. And now, when I think of him, I see a man who was trapped by the same walls I built around myself. I keep coming back to the day after the funeral, when I found his old leather wallet in a drawer. Inside was a faded photograph of me, age 5, grinning with a giant stone in my hand, and a note he'd written, "Don't lose your spark, kid." I held that card for hours, tracing the letters he must have written long before he learned how to show softer things. I read those words until night fell, and then I wept, not for him but for myself, because I had lost something precious by refusing to forgive. I can't change what happened, can't press rewind and say the words I never said. But I can carry something forward from that discovery, some sliver of his intention, even if it arrived too late. I couldn't leave his words in that wallet forever. A few days after I found the photograph and his note, I bought a stack of blank stationery, the kind you spell out, "thinking of you," on the cover, and I wrote him a letter. I poured in every regret, every longing for the conversations we never had, every memory of how I judged him for the anger he could never quite hide and never realized I was afraid of it. I told him I was sorry, for being too proud to call, for believing that distance could heal wounds that needed honest words instead of silence. I admitted I'd missed him before he was gone, that I'd spent years telling myself I didn't care, when really I just didn't know how to say love. I wrote about my fears too, how I worried I would become him, how I spent so long trying to prove myself that I lost sight of kindness. And I confessed that holding on to bitterness had cost me more than any argument ever could. When I finished, I folded the paper, tucked it back into the weathered wallet, and left it on my desk. I could not truly mail it, of course. There was no address now, but sealing those words inside something of his felt like closing a loop. I didn't expect miracles, but I needed to create a ritual, something tangible to mark my passage from resentment toward acceptance. That ritual led me to the cemetery one Saturday morning. I drove past the rows of polished headstones until I found his spot under the sprawling oak. The ground was still tender, and I knelt, tracing his name with my fingertip. I spoke to him out loud for the first time. I told him I forgave him, and asked him to forgive me. My voice cracked, and for a moment I saw a skipping stone arc across an imagined pond, heard his laughter in a breeze. I laid down the leather wallet with my letter, and stayed there until the light shifted and my shame melted into something like peace. Back home, I began to change. The anger I'd carried didn't vanish overnight, but it lost its power over me. I started calling my sister, asking about her memories of the holidays I skipped, the birthdays I ignored. She talked about Dad with a gentle warmth I'd never known, how he hummed in the mornings, how he slowly drew pictures in pencil when he thought no one was looking. Those conversations became our own ritual of healing. We laughed at the imperfections in our family, the moments of grace scattered among the cracks. We cried too, but it felt like relief instead of guilt. As months passed, the shape of my grief shifted. Writing became an outlet, letters to Dad, to my mother who left, even to my younger self who couldn't speak up. I wrote pages every week, until the ink felt like oxygen. I learned to let stories live on paper rather than in my chest. And slowly, I began telling people about him without dulling my voice. I'd say, my father was complicated, and they wouldn't look away. Instead, they leaned in, curious and kind. I realized I was no longer defined by that silent rage, but by my willingness to face it. Standing in my kitchen one evening, I looked at my son. He's 5 now, old enough to feel disappointment when I don't show up at the school play, old enough to ask questions I want to answer honestly. "Why are you sad, Dad?" he asked once, and I told him the truth, that sometimes grown-ups carry sadness because they didn't speak the words they needed to. He shrugged and went back to playing with his toy trucks, but I knew then that I had a chance to build something different, a legacy of openness instead of coldness. In forgiving my father, I was giving my son permission to say what matters. I still visit that wallet on my desk from time to time. I run my hand over the creased leather, open it, and reread the letter I wrote. Sometimes I add a new note, an update on my life, a small hope, a quiet apology for the days I forgot to call. Those notes aren't for him. They're for me, a reminder that forgiveness is not a single act but a path you walk every day. I've learned that peace doesn't come from excuses or forgetfulness, but from the courage to face your own mistakes, speak your truth, and let the past become a teacher rather than a prison. I will never hear his voice again, but I can carry that spark he once hoped I'd hold on to. I keep it alive in my words, in the stories I tell my family, in the patient way I listen when my son stumbles over his feelings. Forgiveness has become my inheritance, more valuable than any photograph or note. And on mornings when the house is quiet and sunlight pours through the windows, I whisper, "Thank you," not with regret, but with gratitude for the lessons he never knew he taught me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this.